program. Our topic this morning is Catholicity and Incarnated Identities, Asian Cases and Theological Reflections. I'm proud to be sharing this table with two very prominent people who are going to share with us what they have learned pertinent to our topic. And our speakers have agreed to flip sequence relative to what's in the program. And so our first speaker will be Father José Mario Francisco, who comes to us from Loyola School of Theology in Manila. And Father Francisco, you have the floor.
Good morning. I hope I bring the sunshine of Manila. Before I begin, allow me two pre-notes. First, that in February of last year, Michael, Peter, and Bill of the center came to Manila, and it is as a result of that visit that I'm here. So I thank them for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to return the favor. Second, I requested that I speak around towards the end of the conference to take care of jet lag, and certainly that worked for me, but I realize now that there were other disadvantages to that, because as I was listening to the first 2 days of excellent presentations and discussions, certain things were popping in my mind and I had to hold them at bay. But I just like to mention two things that came up, two topics that I had done some work on. One was a question of Christianity without borders. In fact, I published an essay called Christianity Without Borders, Impossible? Imperative? And basically what I ended up saying in the essay is that one discovers one's identity not at the center, but by precisely being at the borders. The second area has to do with the religious experience of people on the move, especially migrants, which has come up every so often. I have a forthcoming essay that will be published in the Oxford Handbook on Asian Christianity. So I just mentioned these two things so that if anybody is interested in those areas, then we can talk about them during the break. So now to my presentation. The event that has gathered us this week from far corners of the world to speak about how we speak about God indicates that we can no longer speak about God without hearing each other. First, we, together with our work, travel and cross borders and boundaries with ease and speed, thanks to the global network of transport and communication. Second, we have come to understand ourselves and our work as profoundly rooted in and shaped by where we speak from. Third, since God's communicative presence and action occur within all stretches of time and space, then we seek to be truly Catholic by broadening our locus theologicus and relating what we say about God from our location to what others say from theirs. As a result of these technological, anthropological, and theological developments, our theological discourses are often identified by their origin, commonly referred to by the word context. Theologians in their work bear labels as First World or Third World, Western or Asian, and more recently, from the North or South. As binary categories prone to reification, such labels are best considered heuristic pointers to ways of proceeding or styles of ethos constituted by landscapes and histories. For instance, it has been commonplace to characterize the West in terms of a decline and privatization of religion. In the East, especially Asia, as being religious and spiritual. Moreover, this religious decline has been supposedly brought about by modernity and secularization, as well as by concessions. Religions, particularly Christianity, have surrendered to the modern global world. In contrast, salvific religion is said to thrive in Asia, Africa, and parts of the Americas where manifold forms of deprivation are widespread. These binary characterizations have been questioned on theoretical as well as empirical grounds. Students of religion, I heard José Casanova's name in the bus coming here, have pointed to various types of modernity as well as different modalities of secularity that do not necessarily lead to the death of religion. Moreover, recent developments in the West show religious resurgence in the advocacy of religious groups in the political arena, the involvement of religion in civil society, and even the rise of various fundamentalisms. It is within this general horizon that this essay examines issues of identity and community in relation to Christianity in the Philippines, in recognition of Benedict Anderson's insight that both identity and community are imagined constructions. It focuses on the historical formation of personal identity as Christian and as Filipino, and on the construction of the social imaginary of the Philippines as a central nation. Those two parts are the major parts of this paper, but in this presentation, I'll be omitting a lot from there. It then proceeds to consider the consequences of such a situation for doing theology, not only in the Philippines, but other East Asian contexts, similarly dominated by particular religious traditions, a dominance that has at times erupted in violence. For example, Islam in Indonesia and Malaysia, and forms of Buddhism throughout the entire region. In support of current studies on identity formation, this identity emerged not through the identification of what is seen as essential elements, but through a social process of construction based on diverse interacting forces such as social location and historical experience. Moreover, identity formation occurs in relation to what is consciously or implicitly considered the other. This formation spans Philippine history starting with 16th century Spanish colonization. It began with the construction of native identity as colonized and as Christian, and then of the colonized into Filipino. Hence, this formation process may be appropriately described as translation, understood according to current studies not only as a transfer between languages, but also as the mediation of social worlds across time and space. From native to colonized and Christian. The initial phase of this formation entailed the reduction of barangays, relatively small settlements probably named after the kind of boat that natives used for transport. This reduction followed the pattern of Spanish pueblos, towns with central and satellite communities, a geographical arrangement that facilitated pacification for Spanish colonial authorities and evangelization for religious orders assigned to different parts of the archipelago. This translation of native space provided the geographical infrastructure for the more crucial translation of native languages. Reducir and traducir in Spanish are very much related in meaning, involving movement, trend transfer. These languages of Austronesian linguistic family were used primarily for oral communication and occasionally for short texts like contracts. Moreover, on account of its syllabic script, they proved difficult to learn and read for non-natives. Thus, In accordance with its decision to evangelize in these languages rather than in Spanish as in the Americas, the colonial church translated these languages by transposing their scripts to the Roman alphabet, codifying their grammatical structure with Latin and Spanish patterns, and standardizing usage through dictionaries with native words given Spanish meanings. Missionaries also translated devotional and catechetical texts from Spanish and other European languages, and when already fluent in native languages, produced original religious works. This translation of native space and language sums up the thrust of Spanish colonization as both a political and a moral understanding, designed to reconstitute natives as subjects of divine and royal laws. Bodies were to be reduced to centralized localities subject to the letter of the law, just as Tagalog, one of the native languages, was to be reduced to the grammatical terms of Latin in Castilian artes. Thus emerged a new native identity as colonial subject and as Christian, based on a hierarchical relationship between all things Spanish, and therefore already Christian, and all things Tagalog, yet to be Christianized. Some resisted this identity. Larger organized settlements of indigenous or Muslim populations fought Spanish incursions. Others avoided reduction by returning to their traditional way of life in the mountains and were considered as remontados, apostates who abandoned both colonial civilization and religious faith. Nevertheless, the Christian identity of the native deepened as the late medieval and post-Reformation Spanish Catholicism increasingly took native form. First, on account of the use of native languages for Christian discourse, and second, through native participation, as lay prayer leaders, as writers of native religious texts, and as performers in communal devotional practices. All these created native Christian discourse through which natives could pray in their own voices and recognize themselves as Christian. The second moment in the formation of Christian Filipino identity involved the transition of the colonized into Filipino. With a long tenure of colonization and its changing economic, political, and social situation, different categories under the generic rubric of colonized emerged through an entangled process involving ethnicity, location, and education that culminated in the late 19th century. At first, the term Filipino, in its adjectival and non-capitalized form, was generally applied to any inhabitant of Las Filipinas. It then appeared in the nominative and capitalized form to include those under the category of colonized. For instance, José Rizal, nationalist hero, said of his comrades in Spain, "They are Creole young men of Spanish descent, Chinese mestizos, and Malayans, but we call ourselves only Filipinos." This integration of various groups came about because of the common experience of being under colonial power and being influenced by common education. Native diocesan clergy opposed Spanish friars who refused to give up their parishes. The rising middle class of Chinese mestizos engaged in commerce and agriculture generated resentment among Spaniards. Aside from their common experience of being colonized and wanting to fight colonial power, they often knew each other as fellow students in Jesuit and Dominican colleges. Furthermore, the term Filipino would be later extended to include pre-colonial natives. This identification among various groups as Filipino was aspirational, but would take final concrete form in the creation of the Filipino nation state with the Declaration of Independence, the first in Asia, after the 1898 Philippine Revolution. This emergence of Filipino identity produced fissures in Catholic identity because of the dissociation of the Catholic Church from the Spanish colonial government brought about by the Revolution, and the anti-Catholic and anti-clerical sentiments among some nationalists. Not all Filipinos identify themselves as Christian. However, most did, both from the educated, such as the Filipino clergy, as well as ordinary people involved in various movements for change who saw their struggle against their colonizers as following Christ. One can say then that by the end of the 19th century, native identity as Christian and Filipino has been formed. The impetus for imagining the Philippines as a Christian nation came from the end of Spanish colonization and the beginning of American occupation. In the Church's rendering of the American era, the dominant trope has been one of lost opportunities for the Church to reintegrate itself with secular powers, and the threat of the loss of nation to secularism, Protestantism, and breakaway religious movements. Thus, from then onward, the Catholic Church cultivated in defense the social imaginary as a Christian nation, with occasional support from international and local political forces. The Church's construction was achieved through official discourse, devotion, and social development. Numerous statements from the Catholic Welfare Organization, the forerunner of the post-Vatican II Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, simply presumed the Philippines' Catholic character as a given and appropriated the title Christian nation without reference even to Protestant churches. For instance, in February 1964, in their letter on the 4th centenary of evangelization of the Philippines, they repeat the mantra, "We will always consider the fact that we are the only Christian nation in the Orient as our badge of distinction in the whole Christian world." Moreover, such statements about being not just a Christian nation, but the only Christian nation in Asia, and all it implies as far as mission, etc., were reinforced by issuing them in connection with important religious occasions and devotional practices, such as the Holy Year in 1950-51, the 1954 Marian Year, and the Second Eucharistic Congress in 1956, as well as other patronal feasts and religious assemblies. By promoting devotional practice, the Catholic Church has been emboldened to link nationhood with Christianity, as reflected in the following words of the bishops: "Love and cherish our Christian traditions and culture, because they belong to the basic elements of our nationhood. Love and cherish our national symbols." All this was supported also with extensive involvement in social development. During Spanish colonization and beyond, it provided assistance in diverse fields like agriculture and construction, as well as established social welfare institutions such as hospitals and orphanages, some of which still exist today. It continues to respond to other basic social needs and issues of injustice through parish communities and church-based organizations. And then after Vatican II, it played an important role on the frontiers of social development, fostering economic activity, promoting human rights, and contributing to the overthrow of the Marcos regime and the subsequent democratization process. The underside of imagining the Philippines as a Christian nation is the Church's opposition to any form of nationalism outside its ken. In particular, the Church opposed legal measures that threatened its control of the educational institutions, which of course, as you know, is very much part of Catholic strategy. These measures involve religious instruction in public schools, nationalization of schools, and inclusion of nationalist publication in the general curriculum. I will not go through all those, the details of those three measures. In this defense of the imaginary of the Philippines as a Christian nation, the bishops linked any form of nationalism independent of the Church to those it considered enemies, both old and new. For instance, their statement against those who advocate excluding religion from the national life in the name of a false liberalism could have been issued in the late 19th century. But the Church's strongest language was reserved against communism. Those against religious instruction are accused of exploiting them with preternatural cunning, the evil genius of atheistic communism, and of holding up the godless communist nations as examples of countries that have eliminated many public vices without the need of religious instruction. In this fight against communism, the Philippine bishops were simply following the Church's program then to implement Catholic social teaching, most of which was directed against 19th century European communism, and at the same time aligning themselves with the Philippine and American governments during the Cold War. At the end of the Second National Eucharistic Congress in 1954, the U.S. supported President Magsaysay, dedicated the nation to the Sacred Heart. Barry teases out the implications of such an action. In this Cold War climate, American-inspired anti-communist ideologies resonated within the Church, and assertions of the unique role of the Philippines as the bastion of Christianity in Asia, which were the hallmark of these grand religious events. In the Philippines, to do theology, that is reflection on the critical role of religion within a culture, Lonergan, begins then with recognizing that the formation of identity as well as community occurred within one historical process with interweaving threads. As a result of the historical dynamics between evangelization and colonization, imagining identity as Christian and as Filipino went hand in hand with imagining community as nation and Christian. Other East Asian contexts with dominant religious traditions are also characterized by analogous dynamics, though the religions involved differ according to context. While these traditions might not have ridden the waves of a single global movement as Christianity did with 16th century colonization, they arrived through the region with a movement of population and goods, and therefore had to come to terms also with new languages, cultures, and social structures. They survived and thrived to the extent that they were shaped by these new contexts that they shaped in turn. Thus emerged, for instance, various forms of Buddhism in the region, or even the interaction of Islam with traditional religion or Hinduism in Indonesia. In the end, many of these traditions have become profoundly integrated within national polity and culture, resulting in such commonplaces such as to be Thai is to be Buddhist. This recognition that encompassed the formation of both the religious and national identity and community leads to the interrogation of the understanding of religion implicit in the dominant, often Western-developed theological discourse and consisting of problematic, isolated, related elements. The first, Understanding religion as an integrated system of beliefs, values, and practices with distinct boundaries distinguishing it from other religions emerged, as Cantwell Smith pointed out decades ago, through the encounter of the West with religions different from Christianity. Moreover, in keeping with its emphasis on the rational, these Western views often privileged belief, the doctrinal content of religion, as the crucial linchpin that makes it different from others. This view is best seen as an ideal conceptualization of what religious adherents consider as the core of their religion, based on authoritative sources such as scriptures. However, such a view proves inadequate for critical reflection on religious traditions in East Asian contexts, where these traditions and contexts frequently influence and shape each other. Moreover, though beliefs were part of these traditions, they were often not considered to be boundary setting or even the core of religion. Applying this view of religion has created problematic issues, such as those involving conversion and syncretism. For instance, the authenticity of Filipino Christianity has been questioned on account of a simplistic view of the relation between colonization and evangelization, as well as on an anachronistic view of conversion. Though colonization and evangelization were intimately linked, integration between church and government was not total, often with periodic conflicts. Moreover, claiming that native religious practice did not count as authentic conversion is founded on a modern concept of conversion as a break freely chosen by the autonomous subject from one distinct state, being non-Christian, to another, being Christian. As mentioned earlier, the formation of native identity as Christian is better described as the translation of Spanish Catholicism into a historical form that empowered natives to be Christian. In other East Asian contexts, converted Christians continue to acknowledge layers of their identity that are Hindu or Buddhist. Moreover, the traditional critique of syncretism has been undermined by historical evidence that religious traditions, including Christianity, have always borrowed many elements from diverse sources. The second element in the Western view of religion as a domain independent of other social spaces and entities also appears problematic. Derived from 19th century sociological thought, such a view looks at religion as an institution isolated from other social realities and, according to its latest prophets, foresees the death of religion for the individual and society due to secularization. On the contrary, religious traditions in East Asia or elsewhere are intimately linked with cultures and with the cultures and politics of their contexts. For example, concomitant with imagining identity and community as Christian and Filipino, the religious was not divorced from, but interacted with the racial, ethnic, or cultural layers of personal and communal identities. The interrogation of the dominant view of religion suggests an alternative approach to religion, which makes an important distinction between a religious tradition symbolic capital and its institutional nature. For instance, Filipino Christianity could be described as story, that is, the network of Christian symbols that function as a meta-narrative in Philippine society, and as church, the institutional community of Christians. Such a distinction sheds better light on the role of religious traditions in society. In the Philippines, only 30% at most of baptized Catholics have at least monthly contact with the church. But because of the extensive influence of the Christian story in lowland Philippine culture, the influence of Christianity is stronger. as manifested in the 1986 People Power Revolution that ended the Marcos dictatorship, or even the 1896 Philippine Revolution against Spain, where the poor saw their revolutionary struggle as participation in Christ's passion. Moreover, this distinction unmasks the distorting implications of the concept of a religious nation and points to the need to disimagine it. It allows one to account for a religion's profound influence on society and culture through its symbolic capital, as distinguished from its institutional role in the public sphere. To speak, then, of a religious nation conflates both the symbolic and the institutional, as well as the religious community and the nation. It is true that in the Philippines as elsewhere, the formation of religious community or church or of the nation commonly occurred within related historical processes. For instance, the construction of the Philippines as Christian, Thailand as Buddhist, or Indonesia and Malaysia as Islamic, regardless of the constitutional separation or establishment of religion in each case. Furthermore, religious traditions originate within national or ethnic histories and often speak of themselves in terms of a nation, or even the people of God, the biblical image popularized by the Second Vatican Council, and because of this, the imaginary of a religious nation is reinforced. Thus, the temptation to recreate Christendom appears irresistible. Its pull toward greater integration between religion and governance in general, and the religious community and the nation-state in particular, becomes stronger when such a close relationship leads to effective promotion of social justice. For example, many Catholics were undisturbed by putting at the center of the People Power Revolution celebrations a Catholic Mass, preceded by prayers led by other religions, almost as a concession. However, since these religions are open to and invite adherents from diverse backgrounds, the deconstruction of this imaginary is called for, especially because of its negative consequences regarding the roles of religious traditions in the public sphere. First, disimagining the religious nation would facilitate the inclusion and empowerment of minority religious and ethnic groups who have been excluded by the historical construction of the religious state and the resulting dominance of some religion in particular contexts. Examples are Muslims and indigenous peoples in the Philippines and Muslims in southern Thailand. Dissociating religion and nation would thus facilitate dialogue and collaboration between different religions. Moreover, it would minimize conflict between religious communities and nation-states within the framework of constitutional democracy, since these institutions are distinct and independent, but not isolated from each other, and with concern for the common good, especially in relation to family, health, and livelihood. Consider the negative consequences of conflating them in the Philippines. Catholic leaders recently opposed legislation on reproductive health on the basis of the Philippines being a Christian nation. They argue that the government cannot pass laws that contradict Christian beliefs, or that taxes paid by the 80% majority Catholics should not be used to support programs not aligned with Catholic teaching. Other voices within the Catholic Church and outside correctly pointed to the principles of freedom of religion and conscience, the primacy of the common good, and the separation of church and state. However, because the social imaginary of the Philippines as a Christian nation also makes it difficult to recognize discourses other than the ecclesiastical, there was little dialogue within the church as well as with others, resulting in fragmentation both within the Catholic Church and the nation. In conclusion, all these considerations ultimately lead to the fundamental issue regarding where we locate religious community within contexts where religious traditions as symbolic capital and as institution are intimately linked to culture and politics. Religious traditions have historically employed geopolitical models to foster and structure community. For Christianity in general and Catholicism, with its extensive institutional differentiation in particular, dioceses, parishes, and even the highly commended basic ecclesial communities are imitations of provinces, towns, and neighborhoods. Given the contemporary mobility and alternative connectivity that promote transnationalization, as well as the coexistence of the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern, religious traditions need to reimagine religious community. Perhaps all our identities, like nationality and ethnicity, are best seen as gateways rather than fences through which we enter into religious community. What specific configuration this community takes will likely vary from place to place. For that reason, we need to converse as we do at this conference, so we can speak better of God's presence and action in our own world today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that rich and inspiring talk. Our second speaker today is Rukshan Fernando, who goes by Ruki, and he is the chair of rights now and has been a prominent and apparently highly successful human rights activist in Sri Lanka.
Good morning, and first I'd like to thank DePaul University for inviting me to share some thoughts. I'll start by saying also that unlike many of the other presenters, I am not an academic, and I'm not a theologian, and I didn't go to university, and I didn't go to any seminary. So I identify myself as primarily as a human rights activist, and I will talk about what I have seen, heard, experienced, and my feelings and thoughts about what I have experienced, seen and heard. And I use these two images because my sharing will be largely about injustice, violence, and resistance to that, struggles against that. So I will start by talking a little bit about Sri Lanka, the conflict and the war, and the role of religions in general. Then I would talk more about the church's role, particularly on the Catholic Church, but not only the Catholic. And then I will share some thoughts about incarnation based on my experience, and I'll share 4 particular elements that I thought was important. And then I'll try to go a little bit beyond Sri Lanka in terms of reflecting about incarnation, and then finally some concluding thoughts. And I use a lot of photos and pictures, which I don't necessarily want to spend much time on, but you can see them. So, Sri Lanka is a small island, and I think we are very diverse in terms of our ethnicity as well as religions. So the dominant ethnic group is the Sinhalese, to which I belong to, and then there are some other minority groups. And the conflict and the war in Sri Lanka is largely about ethnicity, particularly between the Sinhalese and the Tamils. In terms of religiosity, the Buddhists are the majority, and we have significant numbers of Hindus, Muslims, and Christians. And then Christians are the only religious group which belong to both Sinhalese and Tamil ethnic communities. And this is important when we talk about the role of the church, and I'll come back to that later. And historically, Buddhism and the state of Sri Lanka was always linked. When we had the kings, the Buddhist monks always thought that their primary duty and obligation was to the king. And the king always thought that his primary duty was always to protect the Sasana. And in our constitution even today, Buddhism is given foremost place. And that's the word, foremost is the word that is used in the constitution. So the history of our war is one of discrimination and harassment of the minority community. There were peaceful struggles which was violently suppressed, and then the demand for power sharing for a federal state was rejected, and then these two led to a demand for a separate state, and then the cracking down on the peaceful protests led to an emergence of armed groups. And the Tamil, the minority communities, the armed groups also became very brutal and very violent. And then of course the government's counter-terrorism campaign was also very brutal. And both these groups, the government and the rebels, targeted civilians and dissenters. And the war finished in May 2009 in what was commonly referred as a bloodbath. The estimates of number of people killed just in the last 5 months of war in 2009 varies from 40,000 to 140,000. We still don't know. And we still have lots of post-war tensions and lots of human rights violations going on. So I'll move on to talk a little bit about religions amidst the war and conflict and churches. So these are some images about how the religious institutions were attacked and religious clergy as well. So on this side is a scene where the Tamil rebel groups attacked a mosque and then killed many Muslims who were praying in that mosque, because they thought that particular area that they wanted to have a separate state was only Tamil, that there should be no Muslims around. And they also chased the Muslim community away. It was a kind of ethnic cleansing where almost 100,000 people were chased away. On the other side, you will see the attack on two of the most sacred Buddhist temples in Sri Lanka. And these are not only sacred, these are also very touristic places. There are many tourists who come to Sri Lanka visit these as historical places. And down below is a scene where the Tamil rebels killed a lot of Buddhist monks, including very young monks, in a bus. The other side, where the government military very regularly attacked churches, Christian churches and kovils. On top is a church where in 2006 one elderly woman was killed and about 70 people were injured when people were hiding inside that church and the Navy shot at it and threw grenades. And then there you can see another church that has been damaged in the war. There are many such churches, and below some kovils. And then there have also been Hindu priests that have been attacked, and there have been many churches and kovils that are occupied by the government military. And I'll come to, in my latter part of the presentation and sharing, I'll come to talk about some of the Christian clergy who were killed and attacked. So interestingly, most Buddhists supported the war, justified and denied atrocities committed by the government forces, and they prayed and praised the soldiers as war heroes. And they vehemently opposed any sort of international involvement, whether it's for a ceasefire, as a peacekeeping force, or now for an international investigation into allegations of war crimes. This was based on the formation of Sri Lanka as essentially a Sinhalese Buddhist country. The Hindus and the Muslim religious communities and their religious institutions were relatively uninvolved. They played a quiet role. They suffered, but they played a very quiet role. And there is also a post-war attempt, the war finished in 2009 May, and almost 4 years ago, to impose and spread Buddhism in the predominantly Hindu northern province, where there is also a sprinkling of Christians and Muslims, but very, very few Buddhists actually. And the Tamil Hindus and Christians are very unhappy about this. And this is one major reason for the tensions that we continue to have after the end of the war. So one of the pictures is a Buddhist monk, a young monk actually, trying a kind of a blessing for the soldiers before they go to war, and on the other side is the Buddhist monks opposing the involvement of the international community. Moving on to talk about churches. Churches, I call churches because we are many churches in terms of denominations. The Catholics are the biggest, and I am a Catholic. But there are also others. Anglicans, Methodists, Baptist, evangelical churches like Jehovah's Witness, Assembly of God, etc. Interestingly, when it comes to the war and the conflict, the ethnicity seems to override the Christian identity in all these churches. So what it necessarily means is that we have a contradictory application of Catholic or Christian values of non-violence, equality, caring for one's neighbor, brother, sister, to concrete situations. This has been the net effect of the ethnicity overriding the Christian identity. We claim to be of one church, following one faith, but our positions are very different to the same situation. So they are exemplified in two very powerful individuals in the Sri Lankan church. On this side is the only cardinal we have, who is very close to the regime, the present regime, to the president. So that's him in the middle, with the president and the first lady on the other side. The first lady happens to be a Catholic. The president is Buddhist. On the other side is a Tamil bishop from the northern province, who has consistently spoken out against atrocities committed by government forces. And I think the photo is an interesting photo where he actually confronts the military, and it's not always possible to get that kind of photo. But that has been his life, particularly in the last several years. And these two, that bishop and this cardinal, has worked together, they meet together, they talk together, but they take very different positions on the same issue. But this is not only with the bishops exemplify and they manifest the differences, but this ranges from the priests to the sisters to the laypersons to young people to youth groups. This is very obvious in many of the programs that I have participated. And we have very different perceptions of reconciliation as Tamil and Christian, as Tamils Christians and Sinhalese Christians. About remembering and versus forgetting, about truth seeking, about accountability and justice, about local involvement and international involvement. We also have big differences in terms of whether we think we should celebrate or mourn the end of the war. And I used to call it in my writings and when I talk that it's like having a funeral and a party in the same family, in the same house at the same time. Because we want to call ourselves the same house as Sri Lanka or as a church. We want to call ourselves the same family, Tamils and Sinhalese, but still we can celebrate, party and dance, and we can cry at the same time for the same thing. And this is an example of that, where on this side we can see some Tamil Christians commemorating civilians who have been killed in a very solemn way, and on the other side we see the Sinhalese who are dancing and partying with the national flag. And down below is a group of Buddhist monks and Christian clergy who are also walking against the involvement of the international community in any investigation into allegations of war crimes. So basically the three roles of the different churches, including the Catholic Church, is one of complicity. Glorifying those responsible for atrocities, blessing and justifying killings, and supporting what I would consider very un-Catholic, un-Christian laws and traditions and practices. And then there is the silent and the neutral. Those who are silent, they claim that they are neutral. Of course, I don't agree with that. I think they are part of the complicity, maybe to a different degree. And then we have the active involvement for change, about which I will talk more in the next section. So this is possibly the meat of my sharing. So I want to start by talking about one oblate priest. So his name was Father Michael Rodrigo. He was from a middle-class family. He went to one of the most prestigious Catholic schools in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, the one I also happened to go by coincidence. And he was an intellectual, and he turned down an offer to teach abroad. He was one of the few priests in Sri Lanka, Catholic priest, who had a PhD, who had a doctorate. But he opted to go and live and work in a very distant and rural village in a very improvised area of Sri Lanka with a community that was very, very poor and that was totally Buddhist. So when he went, the Buddhist monk of that area and the people of the village wondered what he was doing. And they thought that he was coming to convert them. And the expression they used was, he is coming to pour water. But he lived as a very poor villager. This was in the 1980s, in a very small hut, without basic facilities, with no electricity, no furniture, no attached bathroom. He did not wear the religious garb, a cassock or anything like that, and he didn't build a church. So very soon he integrated himself into that community, and on one occasion when the local Buddhist monk had to be away and they were wondering who to invite to preach the Bana, he said, this priest is very good, he can come and preach, he is as good as me. He also became part of the struggle of the poor villagers for social justice, particularly in terms of land issues, where powerful multinational corporations were taking over the land of the villagers. So he confronted politicians, military and business enterprises, clearly taking the side of the poor villagers of that area. And he was threatened, but he opted to stay on, he didn't leave. And on 10th of November 1987, he was shot dead while celebrating the Eucharist, privately with some of his colleagues in his own little place. There were about 5 of them who were celebrating the Eucharist with him when he was shot. So, coming to the 4 elements that I want to highlight, I think the first part about incarnation is by being poor, by experiencing suffering. And I think coming from Sri Lanka, where hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced for decades, it's very easy for me to imagine Jesus as a refugee child who was born in flight. As a baby who was born because his mother had to flee because of a decision taken by the rulers of that time. And this, the below image is actually from the Philippines. So not from Sri Lanka. No? This was, I think, by an artist who drew that based. Yeah, it's a real image that artist drew based on his observations. So basically, Jesus was poor. He identified himself with the suffering, and he was ready to suffer. And there are many examples from Sri Lanka. There are priests and sisters who opted to stay in the war zone amidst the final stages of the war. One died, one disappeared, we think he's probably killed, one lost his leg, and others suffered immensely. They were detained for several months. And many others lived very dangerous and very minimalistic lives. And this is important because they had always other options. In fact, the president himself and the nuncio asked some of these priests and sisters to leave the war zone. They offered them safe passage. But some of these people, they refused. So these are some other examples, and this is a convent that some sisters are staying. And this is a marked contrast if you go to the convents and the churches and the very comfortable lifestyle that many priests and religious clergy live in Sri Lanka and in many other parts of the world. So these are some more examples of how the church tries to spend time and share with the suffering of the people. And the second element that I want to highlight is that incarnation is by being part of the struggles of the poor. And this goes back to the Bible of Jesus' mission, where he says, I came to bring good news to the poor, and that I came so that they may have life and have it in abundance. So I guess the challenge for us in Sri Lanka as church has been to identify who are the poor in Sri Lanka today, and what could be the good news for the poor in Sri Lanka today, and what can we do to bring that good news. What would be the good news to political prisoners? What would be the good news to families of disappeared people who are waiting years to find out what happened to their loved ones? What would be the good news to people whose land is occupied by the military? So the challenge has also been to go beyond charity and to be able to deal with root causes of injustice, structures, laws, policies, traditions, practices which are unjust. So these are some examples of how the church in Sri Lanka has tried to identify with the struggles of the poor. These are some funerals of civilians who were massacred during the war in Sri Lanka. And it was a time when funerals were almost forbidden. And there was one priest who was actually killed for doing this in Sri Lanka. So this was already a very dangerous way of being part of struggles, just to participate in a funeral in a public manner. And these are some other events. On top is a recent service by the Anglican Church in Sri Lanka last February, when Sri Lanka celebrated independence from the British. On February 4th, where the Anglican Church said that no, we don't have anything to celebrate right now, we need to lament for what's happening to our country, what's happening to our people, and our own role, our silence and inaction. And below is something that happened when the war was going on. On the other side are two commemorations of civilians and priests who were killed. So these are some priests who are identifying themselves with families of disappeared people. Below is another priest with a group of people who are trying to resettle in their village after the war, and they are stopped by the military. Here is a couple of priests and lay Christians, a group which I was part of, trying to observe the trials of journalists who were in prison, coming out of courts. Some public marches and protests. Some reports, statements that talk about the sufferings of the people. Some street activism. These are some images I want to show that I have taken about how church buildings are used in terms of being part of the struggle. So on top is doing a documentation of about a person who disappeared, listening to the family, and that's inside the church because there's no other space to do it, and the military will come and threaten us if we do it in another place. Other side is a small church where we do a little bit of awareness raising. Below is a sick person in a very rural area where he has no place to lie down. If you look very closely, you will see there is a saline that is hanging down that he is getting treatment for. And the other side is a school that was functioning inside the church. And these are many people who are displaced stayed in churches during that time. And this is some more advocacy-oriented work that the church leaders are doing. Above is a testimony, a very daring testimony that some clergy, including a bishop, gave in the north to a reconciliation commission appointed by the Sri Lankan government. And below is one of the Catholic priests who went to give testimony to the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And this is at a time when any involvement internationally going to Geneva is called being a traitor. So the third one is maybe through incarnation, through sacrifice and martyrdom. Because this is also what Jesus did. So Jesus was killed because of what he was doing, what he believed in. And he said the highest sacrifice is to give up one's life and to be able to risk losing the life, as many people across the world have done, not only in Sri Lanka. So these are some of the priests who have been killed or disappeared in Sri Lanka just in the last 5 years or so, since 2006, last 6 years. And there are many even before that. And these are some of the other, this is the bishop I spoke to you about earlier, who's been threatened and intimidated repeatedly. And then some other priests who have been threatened, questioned by intelligence because of the work they are doing. And these are some of the churches which gave shelter to people who were fleeing from the violence. And these are not only Christians, these are general civilians who flee from the violence and try to take shelter because they think a church is safer than their own houses. But very sadly, we have found out that even the churches are not safe. In the church over there, 27 people were killed in 2006 when the military bombed that church. The fourth one, and I think this is particularly unique to Asia and Sri Lanka particularly, is incarnation by identifying with other religions and other spiritualities. So the idea is that we don't try to evangelize and convert, but we try to be evangelized and be converted in terms of our values, in terms of our perspectives, in terms of our attitudes. And we try to move away from that superior complex where we think that we have the one and only truth and we are the only way to salvation and liberation. And all the others are damned, including other Christians. And this is a feeling that is very dominant among Christian churches in Sri Lanka, where the Catholics think that we are the best, we are the real one. The others are not. Others are a little bit lower than us. So this is a reflection from Christmas in 2008, where I did a reflection about it and about where Jesus would be born in Sri Lanka, because I went to Mass in my parish church, which prayed for a military victory and for the continuation of the war. So I was writing that, reflecting that it's very unlikely that Jesus would be born in a church like that, which was very nicely decorated, and which had people dressed very nicely coming for the Christmas Mass. But I thought Jesus is more likely to be born in a battle zone, in the war zone, in one of those churches I showed before, or in one of the prisons where political prisoners are, or in the house of a family member of a disappeared person, or among the thousands or tens of thousands of displaced people. So moving on to some additional reflections. So I think in a conflict like Sri Lanka and many other places in Asia, like Indonesia or in Nepal, not so much in Nepal, but in India in some places, Philippines, where the conflicts are based on identity, I think the Catholicism or Christianity is a resource to respect and promote, in one way, the group identity, to respect that particular uniqueness, but also to overcome the group identity. Because we care about each one and we consider every person as a child of God, as a human being, as our brother or sister. And in Sri Lanka, this particularly means Sinhalese caring about Tamils, Tamils caring about Muslims, etc. And this goes down to the principle that we all think that we are equal before God. And when we think of who is our neighbor and where is my brother and sister, we don't think of the ethnicity or the religion or the color or the caste. Another question that we are often asked is whether we isolate and damn the rich and the powerful. And I think this was also dealt with by someone yesterday. But I think my reflection on that is that try to go back to the Bible and reflect on how Jesus tried to deal with the rich and the powerful. Certainly not to glorify and justify and to bless their evil deeds, their sinful acts. But I think for me, the three significant things is to condemn what is bad, what is evil, what is sinful. But to challenge them to be different, to behave in a more human or more Christian way, and to try to convert them to a better behavior, to be more Christian in their behavior. And I think this is the challenge that some Christian clergy who minister to politicians, who say Mass to military personnel, who claim to be Catholics, face. And then I think the Federation of Asian Bishops Conferences have discussed a new way of being church in Asia, a triple dialogue with cultures, religions and the poor of Asia. But I believe for me the incarnation is much deeper than dialogue. It's risking more, it is sacrificing and giving up more by identifying, by sharing suffering and being part of struggles for liberation. And I think the liberation theology, when it came to Asia, there were two prominent Sri Lankan theologians, Oblate and a Jesuit. And I think they stressed 2 points. One was option for the poor and option to be poor. Not only option for the poor, but option to be poor. And then the contradiction of having many religions and spiritualities in Asia, but the continuing oppression and the injustices and the poverty that we face. And that this is the contradiction that we need to address in Asian theology of liberation. So these are some of the things that I have come across. So when I went to India, I came across Dalit theology. Dalits are group of people who are called untouchable, outcasts, not even low caste. In the Philippines, there was the theology of struggle, where people identified, they said, no, yeah, liberation is a very long journey, but what is important for us is the journey towards that, which is the struggle. And then in Korea, I came across Minjung theology, which is about putting the poor people at the center of theologizing. So this is an image from the Philippines actually. I think Father might recognize it. This was drawn by, I think, a former priest, right? Edicio de la Torre. And this is it's not easy to see it, but if we look closely, we will see one is a clenched fist, the other one is an open arm. The clenched fist signifies the struggle, and the other open arm signifies the openness, but also calling for solidarity, calling for support. So concluding is that, so this is not, the 4 elements that I shared is not actually new, it's not my ideas actually. I can trace it back to Vatican II, where it's, Vatican II said the joy, sorrows, aspirations of the world must be those of the church. And I think that is very much incarnation. So about incarnated identity is very much about being poor, struggling with and for the poor, being ready to sacrifice and being in communion with other religions, spiritualities, and even those without religions. And grappling with the separation of the secular, the sacred, church and the world, and the reality that everything is about politics, whether we like it or not. War and peace, class, economy, culture, even religion, education, health, transportation, welfare, everything is about politics. Not necessarily political parties as we identify, but it is about politics. Things to do with human life. So the challenge is to be incarnated, to have a Christian incarnation in laws, institutions, policies, traditions and practices that are secular. And finally, I think the one big challenge is to politicize spirituality so that our spiritual values, our Christian values is reflected in the politics. And then to spiritualize our politics. So these are the things I think that go together. Otherwise, our spirituality will be very shallow and empty and very distant from day-to-day life of people who try to live and practice that spirituality. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank both speakers, not only for their really quite exciting and challenging ideas, but also for voluntarily staying within the agreed upon time without any enforcement by me. And I will now open the floor for questions. Yes, Alex.
For Ruki, 2 short questions out of personal interest. My research is on the Vatican. First, what is the role of the Holy See and the local nuncio in the conflict? And secondly, what should be their role in your view?
Yes.
Okay, so I think the Holy See has played a very quiet role. And I think my personal opinion is it has been very counterproductive and very negative. I remember when our president went to Europe, the Pope was the only one who, Pope Benedict was the only one who actually agreed to meet him, and I think it was twice in the last 6-7 years. And I don't think there's any problem with that if the Pope's position is made clear on what the regime has been doing. Because I do believe it's the process of what I said, engagement, challenge, and trying to convert them to be more human, more Christian, and all that. But that was not to be seen. What we saw is a legitimizing of a very oppressive regime when the Pope met our president. And the nuncio has been very quiet as well. I mean, the nuncio has visited the war-affected areas on and off. I was also with him on one occasion. But we've had, for example, many priests who have been killed and disappeared, many priests who continue to be threatened and intimidated, many lay activists working in church institutions who continue to be threatened and intimidated. But the Vatican has been very, very silent, including the nuncio, on all these. And I think in the last few years, Sri Lanka, maybe with the Philippines, interestingly, is probably one of the countries where we had the largest number of priests who were killed or disappeared and attacked and threatened due to their involvement in social justice movements. So it's been very troubling. But we have hope, particularly with the new hope, with the new Pope. In fact, I wrote a long article saying that the Pope's, we hope the Pope will learn some lessons from what he did or did not do in Argentina, because it's very similar to what's happening in Sri Lanka now, particularly in terms of looking at reconciliation, looking at seeking justice and accountability, where the Argentinian bishops actually apologized for their silence or inaction during the dirty wars and the dictatorships. The Sri Lankan church leaders have not done so. So I think the Pope the new pontiff could play an important role in doing that. And I think one of the challenges would be possibly the gatekeepers, because we have one cardinal in Sri Lanka who is very much aligned with the regime and very close to the Vatican, because he served in the Vatican Curia some years back. And ordinary people, lay people like us, have very little access to the Pope. So we don't know how we can communicate our joys and aspirations and sorrows to Rome. But if you find a way, I think we hope that things will have a more support, more solidarity from the new Pope.
I'm sorry I missed the first presentation, so this is for Mr. Fernando. When you mentioned culture and politics, a number of us at DePaul are working on economic systems and the idea of how the economy works and microfinance and things of that nature to affect the actual livelihood of the people. When you talked about culture, does that also include in some way the specifics of economic issues that we think are important to alleviating poverty?
Yeah, I think the economy is very, very important, of course, and I think particularly important is the economic policies. So it's not only, I mean, of course, churches are involved in Sri Lanka and I think in elsewhere about microcredit projects and cooperatives and all that, no? But I think what is important is to bring the Christian influence. We need to be incarnate ourselves in the policies, economic policies that our government practices and promotes. And I think that is where the problem is. The policies are not policies that will benefit vast number of people in our country. The policies are not those that will make use of the natural resources that we have and the natural human resources that we have, the talents and the skills of our people.
Thank you very much, Ruki, and thank you, José Mario. We have two questions. First of José Mario, I was very interested in the idea of this imagining the Christian nation. Just wondering if you could say a bit more about that in a country that is still identified as overwhelmingly Catholic, or Christian. Who are the agents of this imagination in the country? And then for Ruki, you mentioned something very interesting about the Catholic Church being the only religious tradition that includes both annuals and seminaries. And I'm wondering if you could also say more about that, how that has worked and what makes it work, and whether that in fact can become a model for the rest of society. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Certainly the main architect, so to speak, of this construction of this imaginary as a Christian nation was first of all the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in the transition from being an American Commonwealth and even after independence, there was the whole question of nationalism, and in fact in the 1950s, right after independence, that was the time when the church felt very much threatened by different forms of nationalism, stemming from secularism, from liberal ideas, and so on. And so the church felt that the way it could continue to exert influence within national life was precisely to promote this idea of Catholic nation. And there I think I mean, the question of motives is always a dangerous one, but rather to say, okay, if the church promoted this, I mean, it was mainly because more than 80% of the population was Catholic and 90% would be Christian and so forth. So in a sense, there is it's almost a given. There's a natural attraction to it, and also it's complicated by the fact that, in a sense, by imagining the Philippines as a Catholic nation, let's say the overthrow of the Marcos regime was possible, the work of the church for agrarian reform was possible, and so forth. So it becomes ambiguous. But I feel that to move on into the future, you have to disengage, disimagine. That's the word that I use precisely. This imaginary. Otherwise, the negative consequence, such as what I illustrated in the discussion about the reproductive health legislation, would continue. And in the end, it will, as I said, make it more difficult for the church to to be open and to dialogue with other religious traditions. 2, it will be more difficult for the church to dialogue with other people in civil society to talk about the common good, because the common good will then be always interpreted within that Catholic language and framework. For instance, when the church was criticized for saying, you're imposing your views on non-Catholics and on other people. And then the church shifted and said, oh, our arguments against the reproductive health are based on natural law. But of course, you know what that means. The church meant that natural law as we understood it. Okay, thank you.
Well, I think there are 3 points that I will tell about Christians having both Tamils and Sinhalese. By and large, it's been a tragedy. It's been, I think, a very sad state of affairs, because when our Tamil brothers and sisters were being killed, their land was being occupied, and when they are in prison, we Sinhalese Christians did not care for them. It is totally opposite to what is in the Gospel and what is in the Bible and what we believe to be Christian. We did not care about our brother and sister. We just said, no, they are Tamils, so we don't care. Or they are terrorists, or no, so they are deserving. That was the predominant reflection. And this is, as I mentioned before, cut across the church, from bishops to priests to sisters to lay people to men, women, youth. The second point is that there have been a small number of people who actually try to cross that divide, peripheral groups. As lay people, as women, as young youth and clergy as well. So where Sinhalese actually tried to work more closely and to spend time with our Tamil brothers and sisters who are suffering. And we also try to have Tamil brothers and sisters come to us and try to understand some of the sufferings that our community, the Sinhalese community, had gone through. And we try to do that. We still try to do that. And I think the third point is, yes, it has a lot of potential for society. So it is a tale of what could have been and what could be and what has not been, unfortunately. But I think that's what from these very small groups, that was we try to replicate and promote more and more. Essentially, before we talk about reconciliation broadly in Sri Lanka, we need to talk about reconciliation between the Sinhalese Christians and the Tamil Christians. Until we do that, and until we try to practice that, until we struggle with that, I think it's very difficult for us to talk about reconciliation in a broader sense. But that does not necessarily mean that we should stay away from reconciliation efforts more broadly. I think it is while struggling to have reconciliation between Sinhalese and Tamil Christians that we can also forge ahead in struggling for reconciliation more broadly. But this really needs a lot of humility. It needs acknowledging the bad things we have done, whether by direct action or by silence or by complicity. So it's difficult.
Thank you, both of you, for your presentations. I have a question for Father Mario. Could you say a word on Filipino migrant experience, the Filipino diaspora, in the sense of how has their own religious experience and spirituality has changed or not changed, their identity, their Catholic and Filipino identity? And secondly, if you have a sense of whether their experience or their presence has or has not changed the local churches and their own experience and identity.
Okay, thank you. Descriptions of the religious experience of migrants are always put in the context of a new location. So, for example, often migrants are described as being between here and there. And so at the same time, their spirituality and their religious practice also is located between here and there. For example, here in the US, and let's say migrants, for example, who come from Central or Latin America, very often they have ties both with a Christian community here, if they decide to be members of a particular religious parish and so forth, as well as the religious community there. And they bring practices across. For instance, in the Philippines, I was telling about this somebody the other day. Filipino domestic workers, for example, in Beirut, have as part of their job walking the dogs of the people they work for. And in the course of their walking the dogs, they have found various Marian shrines in Beirut and outside Beirut. Now they have made that part of the routine, and they have called one of the shrines, the one outside Beirut, as Baklaran, which is the shrine in Manila for Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And every Wednesday now they go there, they have mass and so forth. So you have such translations of religious practice. At the same time, the other aspect of that is the question of what the local Christian community, how the local Christian community deals with the migrants who have now become part of that experience. And this is very prominent, for example, in Japan, where the influx of many Filipinos into Japan and into the Japanese Catholic Church has in one sense upset the Japanese Church on the one hand, and this is a credit to the Japanese bishops. They have said, we welcome them. And yet on the other hand, the Japanese bishops were, as well as the Japanese Catholics, were also concerned that their attempts at coming up with a vibrant Japanese Catholicism is not overrun by Filipino Catholics. So you have a process of negotiation. The Filipino Catholics, in fact, said, "Oh, we come to church here and we do not want to be treated as foreigners. We cannot be foreigners within the church. We are already foreigners in the Japanese nation." And yet, at the same time, they are shocked when they go to Sunday Eucharist. They say, "Oh, it's like going to a funeral in the Philippines," because you know how formal and meditative the Japanese are, and you know how vibrant and singing and dancing Filipinos are. So, but that is precisely an exercise and a challenge to being truly Catholic.
Any more questions? Well then, I will use my authority to declare this session closed. Please join me in thanking once again.